welcome. And let me introduce you to the International Center for Sustainability, which is what's facilitating this conversation. My name is Sachin Nanda. I'm the director here at the ICFS. And really the ICFS, in a nutshell, is a research organization that looks to work really between London, Washington, and New Delhi. So bridging India with broadly UK, Europe, and the US. And what we try and do is we try and do research and fill in knowledge gaps across all three regions. We do a lot of learning and development programs between peer-to-peer learning. So that's business and political leaders, as well as academics and researchers and policymakers. And then the third thing we do is we try and we nudge policy in all three countries in the right direction towards sustainability. So that's what we do. We're a not-for-profit. We are supported by people like yourselves, well-wishers, and generous donors. We specifically don't take any money from governments just to keep us independent and free to say whatever we like. So we can be radical in this space, and it's okay. So that's the International Center for Sustainability. Before we get started, just a quick housekeeping. So you know, we are also broadcasting this live. So on those cameras there, people are also joining us from across the world, it seems. It seems like for this paper release, we have people from Honolulu and we have people from Brisbane. So God only knows the time zones that we're covering. But if you've joined us, welcome, whatever time it is, wherever you are. And the event is being recorded, so just for your information. Housekeeping, we're not expecting any fire alarms. So if a fire alarm does happen, some of our volunteers will help you out to the designated areas. Phones, please, on silent if you can. You can take photographs throughout the event. Just make sure I look good in them. And do tag the ICFS on LinkedIn if you post it on LinkedIn. Toilets are, if you go back up the stairs, the ladies are on the first flight and the gents, because you need to do more exercise, they're on the second flight. The toilets are there, so by all means, you can go as and when. So really, this is a super evening because I think we're about to, and I hope all of you have got a copy of Why We're Here, which is this paper that's being released, that's been co-authored by my two companions here. So I'll introduce them just in a moment. Really, this paper launch is the first in a series, I hope, across the year from the ICFS. So we have a small team of researchers here in the UK, and we have a full-time researcher over in Delhi who does a lot of the field work as well. And really the idea behind the center is to really think hard about some of the biggest and toughest challenges that we all face. And to give context to this, which my colleagues will obviously build on, but just to introduce the evening, this paper really comes out of a linkage between higher education and representative democracy, liberal democracy. What are the connections? What are the challenges that we face? And most importantly, we'll hopefully get to the point of what are some of the solutions? What are some of the things that we can practically do, both from a policy perspective, but also from an institutional perspective, in the short term, medium term, and maybe even the very long term, but we'll definitely concentrate on some of the practicalities. So without further ado, let me introduce you to my colleagues. So on my left, we have Pavel Cenkl from Prescott College. Pavel has been an academic for more than 20 years, focusing and thinking really hard in research on education, particularly, and pedagogy. Pavel is really, as far as I can see, one of the key leading lights when it comes to this notion of regenerative learning. right? And I think it's a very, very exciting space. I think it's something very pioneering in essence. And of course, the thing that Pavel loves the most is that he's a fellow here at the center.
Absolutely.
So, so welcome, thank you. And Pavel has come from the United States just yesterday.
Yes.
Well, yes, it's yesterday. So you know, we've dragged him in here to present the paper to us. On my right, I have my colleague, Dr. Pravar Petkar. Dr. Petkar Pravar is a researcher here. He's the head of Strengthening Democracy Desk. He is a constitutional lawyer, but let's not hold that against him. Even worse, he's from Cambridge. You know, but again, let's not hold that against him. He has some really good things to say. So Pravar looks after the Strengthening Democracy Desk and really does the deep dive in really thinking hard about some of the challenges that our democracy here in the UK faces, but also some of the challenges that democratic institutions face over in Washington, but also in Delhi. So Pravar's job is not an easy one for sure. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set up the conversation by asking my colleagues to make some opening remarks about their paper and about their ideas. And then we're going to dig into those a little bit. And then we're going to open it up for a Q&A afterwards as well. And so for those of you who are online, you will be able to submit your questions on the Q&A panel that you should be able to see. And I've been assured that those questions will arrive to me. So then I can ask my colleagues here. So without further ado, let's get going. So I suppose that the opening question, I think to just frame it for all of us, is the big why, yeah. Right? And so I'm going to start with you. Yeah. Just 5 minutes if you can. Why are we talking about this? What is fundamentally at odds currently in the higher education space?
Well, thank you, Sachin, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you, everyone, for coming. You know, really looking forward to the dialogue that will ensue both this evening and beyond as we launch this paper. And also to Pravar, it's been a joy writing this with you over the last almost year. So really grateful for that. So those pleasantries aside, we're going to dive right into a deep, dark place, right? Because I think the answer that we were jokingly saying before is what is not wrong with higher education at the moment. And I know I have colleagues here who are in various parts of higher education, whether it's teachers or administrators, and that's incredible work. I'm a dean at Prescott College, the academic dean, so I oversee the whole of the curriculum. And I think looking at it institutionally, structurally, right, there are some fundamental challenges, and I want to think about 3 different things. Both of them, all of them have the word crisis in them. So I often draw on the work of a fabulous researcher and designer, Neri Oxman of MIT, who coined the phrase crisis of form. And I think higher education has been in the midst of a crisis of form for a number of years. And by that I mean, like, if you think about the natural world, nature doesn't decide, oh, I'm gonna make a tree. What do I have that I can make a tree out of? Rather, the ecosystem builds what the ecosystem can organically, and it happens to be in the shape of a tree, right? So it doesn't have the shape of a tree in mind, right? What happens is it grows organically out of the materials that it has. So when I talk about a crisis of form in higher education, and in a lot of institutions, it's because we've come to it and said, all right, we have these boxes that are called education. How do we teach the things that we need to teach within these boxes that we have, rather than thinking about it the other way around, which is we have these wonderful things to teach in relationship, in ecology, in regenerative systems, etc. How can we create institutions that can foster that sort of learning? Right. So for a century or more, we've been trying to put those great ideas within these boxes. And I think there's a real challenge that now the boxes are crumbling. Some quite literally. I've been in some of those. And then some certainly financially, bureaucratically, organizationally, structurally, in many different ways, right? And so the other versions of crisis are in 2023, I think even the World Economic Forum agreed that we are in the midst of a polycrisis. And to get a body like that to use terminology in that way, that said it's a confluence of the climate crisis, the social and cultural upheavals, economic crises, all coming together in a way that's almost untenable. It's so complex. And then more recently, a wonderful writer named Zach Spine, coined the term metacrisis. And effectively, by using that word meta, suggested that education is not doing anything about it, but in fact contributing to these polycrises because of the way that it's structured in these forms. So because we're so rigidly connected to all of these other institutions and structures, we're not doing education any great service. So, the work that Pravar and I looked at in this paper, straddled 3 continents, right? 3 specific countries. So looking at the US, the UK, and India. And we can go into details about each of those, but effectively, just some touch points. The challenges in America, you've been reading about in the news certainly, but also even before some of the politics come into play, there are $1.7 trillion of student loan debt in students in the US. And 150 billion of that has already been financialized as on the marketplace. So effectively, the financialization of student experience and debt for the market, which takes away the whole essence of why are we educating these students in the first place? Or are they products, or in fact, are they consumers? In the UK, I don't have to enumerate some of the challenges that we're seeing: increasing debt and faltering institutions, and unfortunately job losses as a result of an unsustainable financial model, which in some ways has not increased undergraduate student fees since 2017. And when the government decided to finally do that, they raised them by £285 and said that that's going to solve all of the problems, which clearly it is not. So I think those two, right, are largely financial, but they're because the institutions are shaped and structured the way that they are. And I think similarly in India, where there's significant government regulation over the higher education sector, that you have a larger box within which you're trying to create some sort of innovation. And I think there's significant barriers, with a few notable exceptions that we'll talk about, right, that are barriers to this innovation, barriers to thinking about a sort of outside the forms and outside the structures, right? So to me, I think one good visual for this, and before we get into the solutions, the potential solutions, is that we're stuck in these rigid boxes, and we're trying to find a way out.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll pick up some of those threads in a moment. Particularly from your perspective, then, so that's education, but then from a democracy perspective, what do you see? What is the challenge, the why? I suppose.
Well, I think with a question like that, it's where do we even start? And I think really, in order to look at this issue, we need to take a little bit of a step back from the day-to-day politics that we see around us. What are the issues within the system itself, within the box itself, to put it in the terms Pavel's just used? And I think there's 3 overarching trends, 3 overarching issues that we can look at. First, weakened mechanisms of accountability. In the UK, months, weeks even after our new Prime Minister came in, we had the scandal over his expenses. Under our previous government, we had contracts being handed out to people with clearly no expertise, no business background in the fields that they were being asked to provide services in. In the US, we have a systematic attempt by the current president to remove the guardrails that exist within independent federal bureaucracy. In India, we have challenges too, I think. We have the questions around the election commission last year. We have potential issues around the enforcement directive and the arrest of state-level politicians and more. So we have these systems, we have these guardrails in place, but these guardrails are not curbing the behaviors that we want them to be curbing. Second, polarization. The whole idea of democracy presupposes that we can see ourselves as some sort of unit engaged in a collective goal of some kind to govern a society, to shape the world around us. Yet again, in all 3 countries, I think we see fault lines. In the UK, Remain versus Leave, the Brexit debate, we managed to create a complete fissure in our whole politics that I think now is ebbing away slightly and is perhaps being replaced by other things, the culture wars, for example, but lingers. In the USA, is it still the case that Republicans and Democrats see themselves as contestants in an electoral race, or do they see themselves as an enemy that has to be overcome? Those are two very different psychological perspectives. In India, unfortunately, caste still shapes our politics. There's manifold evidence on this. It played a role in the last election. What is the future of communal relations, of relations between Hindus and Muslims in India under the current regime? So social polarization, we cannot see ourselves as a unit. And then the third issue in all of this is public service delivery. Notionally, the state is there to provide some basic goods to its citizens in order that they can live their lives. Sam Friedman, who is a former Conservative special advisor, has even gone so far to call the UK as a failed state. And what he means by that is public services don't work. Just yesterday, I was in the car in the Midlands, and the number of times that I saw potholes on the road, it's a really small example, but we can't fix our roads. Our NHS is crumbling. Prisons, probation services, the list goes on. India too is facing issues. Can the government actually tackle the current unemployment crisis? Can it enable India's growth forward? These three things together, I think, represent across parties, across countries, some of the problems that we face. And I think the question we then have to ask, Pavel was saying, we put ourselves in a rigid box. I wonder if we've done that with our democracies as well. Have we put ourselves in a rigid box where we've said that there is a model, the model that for entirely good reasons has dominated our politics for the last 30 or 40 years? Should we really be asking, are there problems with that model? Does that model still serve us? And how can we start to improve it?
Okay, thank you very much. So that's very three clear areas as to why you felt democracy is challenged. Okay, fine. So let me briefly move, because in this paper, you both elaborate at some length conceptually as to then what ought be the direction we move in. So we'll start off with education first, and then we'll come to democracy. So again, just in a few minutes, Pavel, explain to us a little bit about the trajectory you see and some of the core principles you see that you think would solve some of these structural problems that you just highlighted.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll pick on you a little bit, Sachin, because this is the International Center for Sustainability, right? And I bring this up quite frequently because the word that, sort of the term or the framing that I like to use when talking about education is regenerative learning. So thinking about regenerative design and sort of different ways to sort of create frameworks or paradigms or spaces or invitations. Because when I talk with groups of educators, largely, the first question I said, well, if it's sustainable, what is it that we're actually sustaining? Are we sustaining an unsustainable status quo, effectively? Are we maintaining these boxes, right? So some of it's terminology, but effectively what I see conceptually, then we can get into some specific examples there, is a sort of full engagement of an adaptive, sort of ecologically grounded. So using ecological models, for governance, for curriculum design, for development, for community engagement, effectively looking at an education which is far less transactional. Thinking about sort of transactions of knowledge as opposed to the relational. That you might sort of engage in sort of creative opportunities or engage in experiential learning or place-based activity or community engaged learning, civic education, outside the confines of these higher education structures, right? So I mean, the question for me, I've been really fortunate to work at small progressive colleges and universities for most of academic career as an academic leader. And now I'm at Prescott, Prescott College at the small university in Arizona, where we've been able to, over the last 60 years, we're celebrating our 60th anniversary next year, right, to really try to manifest a curriculum which is at its core at the intersection of human systems, ecology, leadership, and education. All of the programs, from counseling to education to outdoor leadership to adventure education to humanities, etc., all are fundamentally sort of experiential, place-based, relational, sort of relational pedagogy within that context. And not that that's the only solution, but really also thinking about how we relate to other institutions outside our boundaries. And this was the case with Schumacher College, where I was head of college for 4 years prior to moving to Arizona, the Sterling College, where I was for 13 years before that, all quite small institutions which depend upon their relationship with community, building communities of practice in and of themselves, where even the simplest things at that small scale of sharing a meal with your fellow students and faculty and staff members creates a community. My son was raised from birth at Sterling College, and so I think that somehow has influenced his higher education outlook, or his outlook on community and engagement and democracy. So by creating a sort of more relational, and another key term that I use are regenerative, relational, and distributed. If you're taking notes, I think those are the 3 key terms, right? That to move out of these boxes, right? The future of education must be, and I went to all of these places with the intention of this must be at the vanguard. This must be the future, the next step of what higher education can be, which is a cooperative, collaborative model which has relationships across institutions that complement one another and aren't in direct competition always for tuition fees and dollars, and trying to steal the students from King's to go to UCL, or whatever it might be. That you can find parallel, adjacent sort of constellations of educational providers, and those don't need to just be higher education. They can be centers of innovation, they can be nonprofits, they can be NGOs, they can be community centers, they can be for-profit businesses, they can be a center for sustainability, right? Because that rounds out the real-world experience for those students. They're not isolated. I think one of the, I can go on forever, so stop me, but one of the real challenges, I think, that we've gotten to a place where we now have a federal government in the US which is actively hostile against higher education, is because that's not a new thing necessarily, but it's has raised in a crescendo, because higher education is seen by many as not being entirely relevant to their lives, right? Because it is potentially marginal, potentially something that's not accessible because of the exorbitant fees, but also thinking about how the university as an entity relates to its community. And so for me, when I go back and think about how can we take the next step at Prescott, or wherever it might be, how can we take the next step in that relational piece, to sort of create resilience, to create adaptation. So think about all of the ecological buzzwords that are at the core of a regenerative system. And those need to be foundational, from everything from the curriculum up through organizational structure and governance to accreditation and beyond.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so all 3 of those, ecological, relational, distributive, we'll definitely unpick a little bit later on. I just want to come to the democracy side. Having heard what Pavel has just explained and what you both have been co-authoring, what is the solution for our democracy then? Give us some tangibles that we can hold on to that you present in the paper for what our democracy needs.
So I think we first, and I'll kind of give 1 or 2 conceptual headlines and then just explain how those plan out. There's a quote that I came across a couple of years ago about democracy in the UK, and it's that democracy is of the people, it's for the people, but it's certainly not by the people, to paraphrase. And I think that really sums up where we've gone wrong, and I think where we need to be going. The way I view democracy is that there is this constant, and to adopt Pavel's term, relationality between the governed individuals, all of us, the system of government. A genuine democracy, a true democracy, is one where the government is able to respond relationally. You can think of it vertically, but I'm not sure how useful that is as a metaphor. But the government is able to constantly respond to the needs of its citizens. Its citizens are able to constantly hold it to account for those actions that it takes in serving its needs. There is this relationality between the two. How do we get there practically? So responsiveness, things like electoral systems. How do we ensure that the actual makeup of the governments that we elect? Because frankly, it seems that as citizens in a democracy, all we seem to do is go to the ballot box once every 4 years, mark our X on a piece of paper and drop it into one of those black boxes, and that's done. So how do we ensure that, first of all, that those exercises of voting become more meaningful? And second of all, how do we bring more participation into the system? There's been a lot of talk about citizens' assemblies, about participatory budgeting, more public consultations, some enabled by technology. Dare I even say it, referendums. I'll leave I think the jury's out on that one. But how do you actually meaningfully bring the people into the system in a way in which their voice is heard in the policy-making process, and in which they're put in settings where people can actually come together, share their ideas, share their diverse perspectives, and collectively deliberate about how ought our society to be formed? How are we practically giving people those opportunities? How are we fostering conversations, both within the formal decision-making structures and outside of them? So I think really the watchword here is participation. But of course, in order to get to that participation, we need to be enabling people to participate. And I think that's where what we're both talking about sort of nicely links together in the middle. How is it that our societies today are equipping people to participate in how that society is shaped?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it feels like, and I think we spoke about it earlier, it feels like you've got almost two separate rivers of democracy and education that then are having this confluence, where effectively what you suggest is that higher education needs to be an enabling force for a more participatory democracy and institutions that allow us to participate. But you can't do that unless we're capable, and feel responsible for the world in which I live in, right? My community.
And if I can just briefly extend that metaphor further, if you'll humor me, not only two rivers coming together as a confluence, but actually you've got your education system here, you've got your democratic systems here, and typically we think, okay, one's over there and one's over here, but actually there's this linkage between the two, where you've got things that happen there that are flowing into here. The crisis of higher education that Pavel outlined, that has an impact on the citizens in our democracies. The crisis of democracy, Trump being the obvious example, is directly impacting what happens in higher education. So we're not actually dealing with two separate systems. We're dealing with almost a sort of, a confluence, a loop, a linkage, a corridor between the two.
I want to just transition our conversation into a little bit of just an open Q&A between us. Well, we can all jump in together, but I want to just pick up on something that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I want to pick up on something that you mentioned in the paper, but I want to put it particularly in this context here. So in the paper, you use the word, and I think this is quite powerful, but often it can just be missed. You say that it is both deinstitutionalized and which decenters the individual.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So I want you to unpick that for me a little bit, and specifically in the context of, you mentioned market or the marketization of knowledge, right? Which I think you were getting to. And I know there's many of you here also who will say that the marketization of knowledge is problematic. So just unpick these things for me a little bit, and then of course jump in as and when you need.
So I mean, I think I used a lot the prefix D quite a bit in that paper, right? Deinstitutionalizing, decentering, because I think some of those things are inherently problematic, right? I mean, we need
Tell me what you mean by that.
Right. So if we think about the educational institution, I don't mean the institution of education, right? But there's a distinction, because I think education as a concept needs work, right? But it's the institutions within, the monolithic institutions that are separate from one another, that compete with one another without collaboration, right? They don't see themselves necessarily as part of an ecosystem. They're part of a fairly structured and rigid hierarchy, which has been marketized, right? And that leads to some significant challenges, such that, in the States as well as in the UK, and I think less probably so in India, there's an epidemic of small progressive college closures. And it's every month, at least a couple of colleges or universities in the US close because they're unable to compete within the bureaucratic, economic, the models that exist. So it's really already a hostile environment, and I think largely because it's monopolized by fairly substantive institutions.
By scale, right?
By scale, right? And so one of the potential solutions to that is the sort of decentering or distribution of responsibility, of risk, of expertise, right? I think the fellows right at the center are a great example of that, right? We're not all here, right, but we're around the world and can contribute our expertise in complementary ways to build the organization. Right? So I think if you look at, and it takes a little bit of a leap of faith, right? And it also takes a lot of work in terms of creating that relational space where there's trust. There's some really interesting opportunities for new financial models, right, which we can certainly explore in some detail. Because as you're looking at networks that are distributed, what is the organizational structure? What is the governance structure?
Yeah.
I'm very much in favor of participatory and shared governance models. How does one manage that on a global scale? That's really quite interesting. And so the decentering piece, that's I think somewhere I talk about decentering the human. So thinking about the larger natural world, the more than human world. I mean, how if you look at that as a distributed system, and I use the term more than human sort of tactically, because we are not opposed to something else, but we are part of a much larger system. So both of those words really speak to the sort of a view of complexity and a view of systems thinking that I think needs to be a solution that's moving forward.
Right. Okay. And I'm gonna just in a one sentence. Okay. Democratization bit piece of all this. Yeah. Scale, right? Capital markets love efficiency, and efficiency is had through scale. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the marketization of education is fundamentally, inherently corrosive?
I think on some levels, yes.
Okay.
And you asked for one sentence.
Yeah.
But I have to give you more than one sentence.
Please. Okay. Two.
Right. We're being so similar. We talked about this before. Similar to COVID as being a sort of time of potential innovation because we were pushed into low residency program. We were pushed into different sorts of models. I think this has to be an inflection point for higher education because of the polycrisis, the meta crisis that we're in. However you want to define that, who you want to pin to it, right? But one example is we're having discussions about how we reframe our tuition fees in American universities because you read about American universities and it costs $50,000 a year.
Yeah.
So often the majority of students don't pay that, right? So the sticker price is the actual cost. So for decades now, it's been you don't want to charge too little because then it seems like your education is cheap and not worth it.
But you're never actually charging that anyway.
Charging that. So we need to sort of reset the market, and if you end up putting 50% of your original fee as your tuition, then that's where it needs to sit, right? And that makes it more accessible and more affordable.
Right. Understood. I just want to come to a second point, and maybe Pravar, you can pick this up, and then again, I'll jump in as and when. You both write something here quite critical in the paper. It's on page 15, where you say the skills and knowledge developed through participation in democratic processes cultivate what Krishnamurti terms the capacity to do things. Just unpack that for us. And Krishnamurti is watching, by the way. So
yeah, right, of course, the gentleman on the wall just there. So I think let's look at what actually a participatory process within an education system is, and then let's build it up from there in the spirit of building from the ground up, which is I think a sort of general theme here. rather than, I am up here and you student are down there, and space makes a huge difference here. Education is not so much, I am a teacher, I am a tutor, I am a lecturer, I am going to give you knowledge from up here and it goes down there. But actually, through things that are much more straightforward, and things that I've certainly experienced both as a student and as a teacher in the higher education sector. How are we, for example, drawing on what our students want to discuss at the most basic level? Where are their voices in the conversations that we're having? Are we teaching in a way that facilitates that? Are we being set up to teach in a way that facilitates that? One anecdote, a university in this country, which I won't name, was after COVID, teaching lectures with 500 students in them and teaching seminar classes with 100 to 110 students in them. There's no participation in a setting like that. And it's an extreme example, but how do we actually meaningfully involve students in those processes? And there's a wider economic part to this as well. I've also been in settings where attendance has been less than desirable. How are we actually empowering students through the system to be able to just turn up and engage and not have to worry about, oh, hang on, I can't afford to pay my rent because my maintenance grant or maintenance loan, as is the case these days, doesn't actually stretch far enough, and therefore I'm having to work.
But I want to pull you back in onto this term you use, capacity to do things.
Sure. So
know, what is it that you want the higher education institutions? What capacity are we talking about, and how do you think that directly?
So we can break it down to a few examples, but the capacity to think critically, to listen actively, to be able to deliberate in a way that is mutually respectful. These are just three things that I think would make a massive difference. To have the basic knowledge about actually how does the world around us operate? What are the different forces that influence it? And I very much see the university space, not just the classroom, but the space as a whole. So what happens in classes, what happens outside classes, as a site on which to enact all of these things, to practice these things. And it's through the doing, and it's through the cultivation of an environment by tutors, by university management, that say through a class on philosophy, for example, you've learned how to disagree with somebody who has a completely opposing set of views on, say, abortion. You can then take that skill into the rest of your life. You can take that skill into a citizens' assembly on abortion. The university becomes the ground in which people learn the skills, they're equipped with the skills to then make the best use of the participatory opportunities available to them. Right. And just to add to this, that's not to say that people shouldn't participate unless they have these skills. The point here is not to be elitist and say that, okay, only if you get to this standard, then you're a worthy participant. It's to say that, frankly, you can have as many opportunities for participatory democracy as you want, but if you don't equip people through your education system to make the best use of it,
how can they engage?
How can they engage?
I think I jump into this just what isn't quite in the paper yet, right? Because we've been having
part two, by the way.
Part two. We've been having lots of really generative conversations about AI and its role and the impact that might have, and that has had, right, on education. And so at Prescott, for example, we put together a multi-page principles of AI use, not a policy, but just principles around ethics, around ecological impact, around things like that. And you're really, I think we're, again, at an inflection point with that technology. It's sort of like when the internet came on, that I think really impacts what you just said. Because in one version of the near future, and I'd be interested to hear what David has to say about this, right? One version of the near future, right, is actually AI liberates us from transactional education. Because why bother if you can just press a button and have that happen? And then we can focus on exactly those principles of community engagement, sort of assessment of information, facilitation, the things that we can do as humans that we actually have put by the wayside because we're teaching transactionally, right? That's the positive view of the future I see, right? There's a sort of more sort of darker one where in fact we go down that road and AI becomes education. And then we no longer have the space to have that that relationality. So I think we really are at the balance of this.
And so if I've understood this right, what you both are beginning to point, if I've understood this idea of capacity to do things, is where essentially we need an education system that empowers the individuals to be connected to their environment, to care about the environment in their local environment, right? So there's localism.
Yep.
So it's localism, right? And then to your point is then you're going to have the nodes where those skills and that awareness can be leveraged and utilized for then to have a real representative democracy.
Absolutely. And I think it goes even a step further than that, if I can just push things. And this is why we come to Tagore, again, staring at us from the back of the room, because it's not just localism. It's not just representation. The institution that Tagore created in India, it's a co-created learning experience.
Yeah.
It's it's learners and teachers, if you want to put it in kind of quote marks, actually staying together, developing the learning experience together. Learners going out into the community and shaping the community around them, but also an environment that isn't just local. And my worldview isn't just, okay, here is the community around me, shorn of those identity markers. It has to be remembered, Tagore, at a time when India was striving for its independence, was a fierce critic of nationalism. He was a fierce critic of dividing the world on different races, different ethnicities. In fact, he adopts a spiritual humanist perspective, saying that we as humans, we the environment around us, we are all one. There is a commonality here that we practice at a local level, but actually that can extend much more widely to the whole world.
Super. I'm going to just pick out something here. So again, you seem to make a point here, and I want to bring up this notion that you just brought up about being connected. You both mentioned in this paper, according to the Future of Democracy research findings at Cambridge, which basically said that we are seeing the steepest, and so I'm quoting, steepest decline of participation and satisfaction in democracy amongst 18 to 34 age group, right? And this 18 to 34 age group, one could argue, is probably the most, the age where you want to be most engaged in your community, most engaged in democracy, or and if that is it, I suppose my question is that the reason, if that group is not engaged, is that why our democracy is being hijacked by fringe voices increasingly, right? So, for example, what am I saying? So if you look at all across both Delhi, London, Washington, you are hearing a similar visceral rhetoric, right? And to your point, because you touched on it about nationalism, but it's on nationalities. It's about identity. It's about identity politics. But are you suggesting that by that group re-engaging through the right education, actually those fringe voices?
So I don't think it's limited to that group, and I think there's two other very brief stats I'll give that give some color. Pew Research Center in 2024 looked at satisfaction with democracy in high-income countries. From 2021 to 2024, the UK has dropped from 60% to 39% across all age groups. The US has dropped from 41% to 31%. Those numbers should worry us. And to your point, it's not just young people. I think there is a dissatisfaction with the current model of democracy at all ages across society. Look at and I think it's sparked by forces external to this. Look at the Southport riots in this country last year. There's social media, there's dissatisfaction around immigration that needs to, rather than being met by slogans, need to be taken seriously. So I think there's an urgent need to think about the system in a different way, craft alternatives to the system that right now, the box is here, and almost I think at times people are sort of having to circumvent the box or find a new channel here. But actually, if we get rid of the big rigid box and think in much more decentered local terms, there can be so many more of these conversations happening. It's actually through that conversation, through that mutual engagement, that we can start to iron some of these things out and start thinking collectively about how our society should run.
Well, that's regeneration.
That's regeneration. That's how a democracy regenerates itself when it's met by these challenges and doesn't just hit a brick wall and stop there.
Can before I move on to the Q&A section of this, and for those of you who are watching online, by all means, please submit your questions on the chat box in the portal, and by all means, those questions will arrive on my phone, I believe. So let's hope that all works. So please do submit your questions online as well. But just before we get to the Q&A bit, Pavel, you mentioned a little bit about, and can you elaborate on it? Because in this paper you do touch on it. You talk about effectively what micro accreditation or modular learning, and can you just kind of gaze into your crystal ball, gazing a little bit, and tell us what is it that you want to see? Where is that you're taking us with this paper in that particular context? And if you can, relate it to some of the things that Pravar's mentioning here in terms of people engaging with the world around them.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that you use the sort of metaphor of circumventing the box, right? We're talking about all sorts of fluid metaphors, the confluence, the flowing around the box. I wrote a piece, a couple of years ago called "Lessons from the Periphery," which is really based on my experience at Schumacher's College, which was largely seen at the periphery of higher education, because it was this very sort of esoteric thing that very few people, and it wasn't really at the core of what higher education was in the UK or globally, right? And the point of that piece was that actually the periphery has a lot to teach the core and sort of the larger institutions. That some of what's done, a lot of what's done, is scalable. And it doesn't have to be a small university with 100 students. It can actually be a larger institution of 10,000 if you have the right tools. And I think toward the end of the paper in section 6, we almost list a variety of different tools which are being used, but not necessarily as robustly as they can be. So these are, in some ways experiments, in some ways they are in a certain sector of higher education, and they're everything from sort of micro-credentialing, micro-accreditations, which...
and you use the word stackable modules. Yeah, I like that framing.
Yeah, stackable modules, which is a term that administrators in higher education use to think about what's the smallest unit of accreditation that you can have? And it doesn't need to be a master's or an undergraduate degree. Is it an individual module of a course? Is it smaller than that? And then, can you give students the opportunity to actually, not really a pick and mix, right? But strategically develop a pathway through a program if they wish to receive an accredited degree, that they would stack modules together over time across institutions, ideally. Which I think is a really difficult nut to crack.
Gosh, you're asking for institutions to work together.
I am. I think that's essential. Because if we don't work together, we're going to fall apart individually, right? And so a number of other things in that list, we won't talk about them all, but talk about the distributed learning model, which is what we're talking about here. Talk about service learning, particularly environmental service learning or ecological service learning. That we've recently integrated into our curriculum as a mandate for undergraduate students. So you are doing community service as part of your curriculum. So you're actually doing civic engagement as part of the assessed curriculum of the college. So I think there are a number of different opportunities, but we need to do them all. Yeah. And we do them right away.
Yeah. And what's interesting, again, from a commercial practical perspective, what you're suggesting that this is scalable, yes. And therefore, there's pragmatism to it, right? Yeah. It's not ideological, right? Yeah. It's very, very pragmatic. Yeah. So let's open up to Q&A. There's a hand up straight away, and you know what they say about the first person who shoots their hand up, right? By all means, please. Oh, and just before you do ask your questions, I do ask, keep your questions fairly terse, but also introduce yourself. So who you are and if you represent an organization, which one is it?
Hello, my name is Michaela Johnson. I'm Head of Impact for One Hive. So thank you very much for today. Actually, I really, really enjoyed it. And I think all of your insights were brilliant. And I will definitely be finding you afterwards to talk. But what I wanted to potentially explore was, so I'd imagine you guys are familiar with the Scandinavian higher education system, in a sense that so it doesn't cost. If anything, students are actually paid to go to university. There's a high emphasis on higher education, and actually their economy thrives from it. So we know that. We also know that Britain at the minute is a little bit broken. That's my personal opinion. I think there's many different things that obviously need to be happening, but one of the biggest challenges is that, and forgive me for being so, I'm going to be brutal, forgive me, but there are so many wonderful people doing so many wonderful things, but we're all just talking about it. So, and I don't mean that I'm also one of those people talking about them. But so one of the things that we need to try and do is obviously get the policymakers to try and change those policies. And for instance, I was always of the opinion.
I need a question though.
Yeah. So sorry. So, question is, in terms of this research paper and everything that we're then talking about tonight, what are your tangible actions leading on from the research paper? Yeah, I do talk quite a lot. So
That's a great question. So we want some tangible things from both of you, please. Before you answer, I'll take one more question, but it needs to be really short and terse. So David, you can place your hand up next.
So I'm David Wood, one of the fellows at the Centre. So my question is about the Department of Education in the US. Many people are saying in the US that they should shut down that department because it's imposing too many constraints and it's not allowing the states or individual schools or institutions to experiment as they would wish. And is that something you would welcome? More experimentation, less centralized control from the Department of Education?
Thank you. Fine. Okay, so let's take that question. Give us some tangible things, guys.
Yeah, well, I can start there, absolutely.
So what are you doing at Prescott? Maybe.
Yeah. So the list of things in section 6 of the paper, right? I don't know what page it's on, but
yeah. It's at the end.
It's at the end, right? Are actual tangible things that either we are doing or that some of our colleagues are doing.
And you give some specific examples, actually.
Right. I give some specific examples. Service learning is one of them. The micro-credentialing piece is another one. So portability of credentials across institutions. There's some really interesting conversation and actually preliminary action. So I think I agree with you, right? We can't just be talking about these things. And I feel like I'm in a privileged position as being the academic head of a university of 100 students, where we can manifest some of these things in practice, whether it's participatory governance or whether it's building network constellations, even with students with universities in Scandinavia. We have an arrangement with the Southeastern Norway University campuses, right? Because I think having that breadth as sort of complementary learning experiences for students, really creates that distributed model, which isn't just sort of fictional. That way, we don't have to provide everything to our students, right? We do need to, further explore the financial models, because that's often where things stop. When people aren't willing to let go of their tuition dollars, right? But I think that's one of the more tangible examples. The micro-credentialing piece, I'd love to talk more about. There's been a lot of research about that, and I think the portability across institutions is quite key too.
Okay. And anything you want to add?
I think just a couple of things on the tangible actions. I was in a conversation, a conference a couple of years ago about reforming public core teaching in the UK. We had a great discussion, and about 6 months later, the organizer dropped me a man and said, yeah, it was a great discussion, but actually nobody has the time to put all these things into action. I think that reflects where we are with higher education at the moment. And I think because of that, to scale this up, we really need to start small. Can we change one seminar of one module? Because time is unfortunately, to an extent, the enemy of progress. So can we start by making small changes in the courses that we're actually running already? And that may not be sort of full on right to the end of the journey just yet, but I think it's by those small steps. And to David's point, are more experiments better? Yes, absolutely. And I think I want to touch on India here because I don't think we've talked about India.
Please.
India's university sector, it's as Pavel mentioned, it's highly regulated. It's only now in the last 10 to 15 years that we're starting to see more autonomous universities coming up. And actually, that creates the room to experiment outside the dictates of whatever it is that the government of the day wants to be taught. And I think it's only through those experiments that we start to see, okay, this works, this doesn't work. This works here, this doesn't work here. Democracies are the same. You know, decentralized federated systems. This works in this state. Oh, well, we're taking this to Scotland. Oh, it didn't work in Scotland. You know, why doesn't Wales try it? So the more experiments, the better. The less control, the better. Yes, you need guardrails, but you need an environment in which ideas can flourish.
Super.
Yeah.
And then David's question
Yeah, I'd
specifically.
love to answer that too. I'm not in favor of the dissolution of the federal Department of Education. It is the smallest one of the departments that they're looking to terminate, or they're looking to lay people off of, right? But what that will do is it will put, famously, I think the president says, the decision making in the hands of the states, right? Which means there's a huge diversity of states with different politics. And what I think that the Department of Education does, I mean, it is responsible for overseeing all the funding for students, which is, most universities could not operate without the loan system in the US. I think similarly to here, right? And it also puts on some guardrails, so there is not a radical departure from one state to the next in terms of curricular oversight. Curricular oversight is largely local rather than federal. But I think the federal government's role is to try to keep all of those roughly together. Yes, there's a huge diversity, but I think it will completely fragment without that.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I think you had a question, and you had a question. So what we'll do is if they're short questions, we're gonna take all three of them, okay? So Atul, do you want to go first, then Pavel will come to you.
Hi.
Will come to you.
Thank you. Atul Shah, City St. George's University, author of a new organic theory of finance. What is the role of faith and spirituality in the kinds of education and democracy you are envisaging? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think first of all, I should commend you for your work. But then, how do you see? I'm Pawan Tamwada. I'm a professor here at Kingston Business School. How do you see the role of business in all this? Because when you talk about regenerative learning, the fact that there is a cost component from the student's viewpoint, he's spending that money. So till such time that corporatization of this whole higher education sits along with your model, how is it going to resolve the conflict that will naturally arise when it comes to students getting into the world of business and the businesses having a completely different set of goals to what ideally democracy and participatory democracy would want to see?
Yeah, spot on. Okay, great. And then, are you both okay with taking one more question?
Well, you have to remind me what the question is.
Okay, let's ask you a question briefly. No, I'm trying to get everybody to have a go.
Hi there, my name's Neeti. I'm an educator by profession. It's really interesting, Pravar, that you bring up experimentation, because my question does kind of focus on that. And to avoid rambling, I'm going to try and stick to the notes. I've taken really good presentations so far. I did have the privilege of reading your paper before coming here, so I've taken a few notes. Your paper emphasizes the importance of regenerative learning and participatory culture in addressing the polycrisis that you mentioned, Pavel, democracy, education, and ecology. But transformative education surely requires time, reflection, experimentation. However, from my own experience, I feel that students and institutions are under so much pressure to prioritize employability, short-term outcomes. How do we, as educators, as people in the education sphere, create the space and patience for this kind of deep systemic learning within education that drives the efficiency and performative metrics?
So your question, is
How do we create that
creating
space?
and time.
How do we create the
create
space and
and
time?
within this drive for performance?
Surely when there is so much pressure
Got
on
it.
those institutions
Got it.
and students to achieve employability, to achieve short-term
Yeah.
outcomes.
Got it.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I did
Brilliant.
ramble.
Wow. Well, there are 3 easy questions, everybody.
Yeah.
Briefly as you can, we'll take the first one because that was about spirituality and faith. What role does it have in this model that you're both exploring and developing?
Yeah. The language that I would use, right, the framework that I use to address those issues, right, is consciousness and inner capacity and engagements on that level. So, working with a project of the UN Development Program, for example, on conscious food systems, we're developing a global network of learning centers there, and thinking about, to complement the SDGs, right, what are the inner capacities? And thinking about relationality and community engagement as effectively a spiritual practice. Those are not words that I would frame it in personally, but really thinking about, sort of derogatorily, what are the soft skills, right, that we're teaching these students? And that goes to your question too, right, in terms of what is the space and time? Because literally you do need, time for transformative education to work. We work in a slightly different model in the US at a liberal arts university. We have a 4th year. And students don't actually declare what they study until halfway through, so they can have the opportunity to muck about in various things. But there's also pressure in the US to decrease by a year so that we get students out of the workforce faster. And certainly a lot of the more liberal disciplines are being sloughed off in favor of STEM disciplines because, we are actually, there's legislation now that would tie the students' first 3 years of earning post-undergraduate to the loans that they get and actually make the university liable.
So that's the exact reverse of what you both have been suggesting.
Yes.
That's going on.
Absolutely. So I think we can't, what you were talking about, Pravar, is we can't think about these as isolated institutions, right? We can't think about the business world. And I push.
So I want to come to that then. If you can then come,
Yeah.
and Bo, I want to get you to.
I push back a little bit and say that, there isn't necessarily a stark divide between regenerative thinking on an educational level, and whether you think about ESGs or thinking about B Corps or thinking about other types of business framing, that I think there's a pathway that could actually make a more regenerative business model. If we run a business certificate, we have an MBA that is now a certificate in effectively regenerative business and entrepreneurship. Right. So we need, I think, more people starting businesses that then, it's a systemic social change.
But it seems really interesting. I'm just going to, because I'm a finance guy, right? In that sense. So, but you mentioned something quite interesting. Universities have incredible amounts of pressure to perform and achieve targets, just like any large organization these days would, right? And professors feel the brunt of that, I suspect, and the management does. I suppose, how do you align those pressures for bottom line performance with the space to experiment, innovate, develop? I think that's the bit that you're also touching on, aren't you? That sort of that seems to almost not add up. It almost seems.
I like the Scandinavian model.
Yeah.
Because you don't have any sort of corporatization of this higher education.
Yeah.
And then there's all those pressures are not there.
Yeah.
And suddenly you can have a fertile time and space for these ideas to mature.
Exactly.
But what happens in the presence of all that? There's a big finance component.
Right.
The universities have to retain their professors, and or employ all those stuff.
Thanks for the way to interrupt, but just quickly and then to you, right? I'm sort of reminded here of the transition town movement, where basically we know where we want to get to. We want to get to this, sort of radically regenerative model. We know where we are, and what is, how do we navigate that space between? So I think there is actually a rich research space which we're starting to get into about how you navigate the steps between here and where we know we need to get to, both in democracy and the business world and education.
Super. Bro, do you want to add?
Yeah. So I think I've got a few points. Atunji's question around the role of faith and spirituality in a democracy. I think what you see from particularly experiments with citizens' assemblies in Ireland on really complex moral issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, is that people do very much bring their faith as a perspective into their decision making. And I think that's something to be welcomed. And then the step forward from that is, how can we appreciate the diversity in these perspectives, but also find that unity, that commonality that links us all together as humans. And I think spirituality, in a more general sense, whether you root it in a particular tradition or not,
The kind of Tagore sense.
in the kind of Tagore sense, can actually enable us to realize that unity and still appreciate the diversity at the same time. Those are not mutually contradictory. In terms of, yes, we need time to transform the learning experience, and I think this might touch on the other question as well. I don't think there is a zero sum between the sort of education that we've talked about in this paper and employability. It's not that we're saying that, let's create a whole load of enlightened individuals, but it doesn't matter, whether they get jobs or not. Actually, I think some of those skills that we're talking about are still valuable in the workplace. And particularly as AI develops, the nature of the workplace is going to change. So where is the sort of, I think there is a middle ground between the two where we can solve both of those things. And just on the sort of role of business in all of this, actually, is there scope for within the learning experience to actually bring businesses and communities into that space, to have this co-developed system? And then you've got your businesses running, you've got the financial incentives and imperatives involved, but then can those businesses also deliver something back to the community? And again, in India, I think is a potential laboratory for all of
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those times. We're out of time. In fact, I let it run over by 7 minutes, but then I thought we started a little bit later as well. So thank you very much to both of my authors and speakers. Thank you to all of you for taking time out this evening and coming, and thank you to everybody online for joining us. There is a physical paper for you just out as you leave. Please do take one. Please stay in touch with the center. We have events here. The next event here is on the 26th of March on compassionate food systems, what we call the K lectures. So by all means, do find out more about us. Follow us on LinkedIn over here. Scan this code. And if you'd like to become a member and give us all your money, then you scan this code over here. And of course, by you becoming a member, you get to be part of this wonderful community and you get to meet likes of Pavel and Pravar a lot more often. So thank you very much, everybody.